Alistair Finch surveyed the glittering expanse of the city from his penthouse apartment, a kingdom of glass and steel that mirrored his own cold, polished existence. Below him, fortunes were made and lost, lives lived in quiet desperation or flamboyant excess, none of which particularly interested him anymore. Tonight, like many nights, found him in the company of men much like himself, wealthy, powerful, and suffocatingly bored. Marcus Thorne, a property magnate with a penchant for gossip, gestured vaguely with his crystal tumbler of aged whiskey towards the far end of the sprawling living area. "Look at that one," Marcus drawled, his eyes briefly following the almost invisible figure of a woman diligently polishing the already gleaming grand piano. "The cleaner, Rossi, I think her name is, works like a bloody machine, barely makes a sound. You ever wonder what their lives are really like, Alistair? What it would take for someone like that to bend?" Alistair's gaze drifted towards Sophia Rossi. She was a quiet shadow in his periphery, efficient, unobtrusive. He knew through a carelessly reviewed HR report on staffing costs that she worked double shifts and was rumored to be supporting a sick mother. Desperate, then. The thought registered with a familiar, detached cynicism. "Everyone bends, Marcus." Another associate, a banker named Lawrence, chimed in, his smile thin. "It's just a matter of finding the right pressure point, the correct price." A spark ignited in Alistair's usually impassive eyes. A game, a diversion from the crushing ennui of his existence. He leaned forward, a predatory stillness about him. "An interesting hypothesis, Lawrence, perhaps one worth testing." He thought of Sophia Rossi, her quiet diligence, her presumed vulnerability born of financial hardship. "This cleaner, Sophia. I propose a little experiment, a game if you will, to discover her price. What would it take, gentlemen, to make her compromise, to perform a task outside her usual duties, something demeaning perhaps for a sum that could change her life?" A murmur of cruel amusement went around the small circle. This was the kind of entertainment they understood. "A twisted game, Finch," Marcus said, though his eyes gleamed with interest. "What are the stakes for us besides witnessing your social experiment?" Alistair smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "If I find her price, you all owe me a favor of my choosing. If she refuses every offer, every test I devise up to a truly life-altering sum, well, then, perhaps I'll concede that one quiet cleaner has a stronger will than I credited her for." He let his gaze linger on his associates, a silent challenge. "Dignity is a luxury, my friends," he said softly, his voice like velvet over steel. "Let's see how much this one's luxury actually costs when reality bites." The game was set. Sophia Rossi, its unsuspecting quarry. Sophia Rossi moved through the opulent corridors of Finch International headquarters like a phantom, her presence marked only by the gleam of polished surfaces and the faint scent of lemon cleaner that lingered in her wake. She was one of many contracted cleaners who descended upon the towering skyscraper after the executives and their armies of assistants had departed for the night. For Sophia, this job, along with two others, a weekend gig at a bustling diner and early mornings spent delivering newspapers, was a lifeline. Her mother, back in their cramped apartment in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, battled a chronic illness that required expensive medication Sophia's meager earnings barely covered. Added to that was the quiet hope of one day helping her younger brother, Marco, finish his community college degree so he could have a future brighter than the one currently stretching before their family. Debt, a constant suffocating presence since her father's unexpected passing years ago, was another shadow she fought daily. Yet despite the crushing weight of her responsibilities, Sophia possessed an unyielding core of quiet dignity. She was meticulously honest, hard-working to a fault, and held onto the simple moral principles her parents had instilled in her. Work hard, be kind, and never compromise your self-respect. She had seen enough of life's harshness to be wary of easy promises or entitled individuals, but her spirit, though tired, remained unbent. Her poverty was a circumstance, not a definition of her character. Alistair Finch, on the other hand, had never known a day of financial uncertainty. Born into a dynasty of old money and new tech, he had inherited a considerable fortune and, with a brilliant and ruthless acumen, multiplied it many times over. His world was one of bespoke suits, private jets, and boardrooms where billions were moved with the stroke of a pen. But it was also a world of profound emotional sterility. He was surrounded by people who wanted something from him: his money, his influence, his name. His few attempts at genuine connection in his younger years had, in his eyes, ended in betrayal or disillusionment, convincing him that loyalty was a commodity and affection a carefully disguised transaction. He believed, with an almost religious conviction, that every person had a breaking point, a price at which their vaunted principles would crumble. This belief wasn't born of active malice, but of a deep, pervasive cynicism, an intellectual armor he wore against a world he perceived as fundamentally corrupt. The game to find Sophia Rossi's price was, for him, less about the money wagered with his equally jaded associates, and more about a detached, almost academic curiosity. It was a way to pass the time, to reaffirm his bleak understanding of human nature, another piece of evidence in his long-standing thesis that dignity, in the face of true desperation, was indeed a fleeting luxury. He gave little thought to the potential human cost of his experiment, for in his world, people like Sophia Rossi were largely invisible, their lives and struggles too far removed from his own to register as truly significant. Alistair Finch initiated his twisted game with the cool detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. His first move was deceptively simple. One evening, after most of his executive staff had departed, he accidentally left his platinum money clip, thick with $100 bills, on a side table in a rarely used private lounge on his floor, an area he knew Sophia Rossi was scheduled to clean last. He had the security cameras in that section subtly monitored, curious to see if the lure of easy, untraceable cash would prove too tempting for a woman he knew was struggling. The following morning, the money clip was on his desk, untouched, placed neatly beside his morning briefing papers. His usually unflappable executive assistant mentioned, with a hint of surprise, that Miss Rossi had found it and insisted on handing it directly to her for safekeeping, refusing any reward. Alistair merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Round one to the cleaner, he thought, a touch of unexpected amusement mixing with his ingrained cynicism. His next test was more indirect. He instructed his building manager, a man named Henderson, who owed Alistair several favors, to subtly increase the pressure on the night cleaning staff, specifically citing a need for heightened efficiency and cost-cutting. This translated into expanded cleaning zones for Sophia, slightly shorter allocated times for each task, and a new supervisor who was notoriously difficult and prone to finding fault where none existed. Alistair wanted to see if increased hardship, the threat of losing her already precarious employment, would make Sophia cut corners, complain, or perhaps become more susceptible to other, less savory opportunities for financial gain that he might subtly present later. He observed, through discreet reports from Henderson and his own occasional late-night inspections of the building, always ensuring he was unseen by Sophia herself, that while the strain was visible in the tired lines around her eyes and the slight slump in her shoulders as her shift ended, her work remained impeccable. She didn't complain, didn't shirk her added duties. She simply worked harder, her quiet diligence a silent rebuke to the manufactured pressure. Sophia, unaware of the specific machinations targeting her, simply attributed the increased workload and the new, nitpicking supervisor to the harsh realities of her world. Jobs like hers were always insecure, always demanding. She pushed through her exhaustion, her focus on her mother's medical bills and Marco's tuition a constant motivator. She knew Alistair Finch only as the distant, powerful owner of the company, a figure occasionally glimpsed stepping out of a private elevator, his face stern and unapproachable. If she ever felt his gaze linger for a moment too long during these rare encounters, she would flush with anxiety, assuming he had found some fault with her cleaning of a common area, and would redouble her efforts to be perfect, to be invisible. Alistair found himself increasingly intrigued. This wasn't the expected trajectory. Desperation, in his experience, bred compromise. Yet Sophia Rossi, despite her evident need, displayed an unwavering commitment to her work and an almost anachronistic honesty. He had anticipated tears, pleas, a gradual erosion of principles. Instead, he was met with quiet resilience. His associates in the bet would occasionally ask for updates, their tones laced with a mixture of mockery and impatience. Alistair would offer non-committal responses, the game no longer just a simple amusement, but a complex puzzle he felt a growing compulsion to solve. His detachment was being pricked, not by any burgeoning affection, the thought was absurd, but by purely intellectual curiosity. What made this woman tick? What was the source of her quiet strength? One particularly bleak, rainy evening, Alistair was working late, a habit he'd cultivated more frequently, finding a strange sort of solace in the silent, empty building. As he was leaving, he passed by a small, forgotten alcove near the service elevators. He heard a faint sound and paused. Inside, huddled against the cold concrete wall, was Sophia. She wasn't crying, but she was sharing her meager dinner, a small sandwich and an apple with a drenched, shivering stray cat she had apparently smuggled inside to escape the storm. She was speaking to it in soft, reassuring tones, in what he vaguely recognized as Italian, her voice gentle, full of a tenderness he hadn't known existed in such a harsh world. She stroked its wet fur, her face illuminated by the dim emergency light, holding an expression of profound, uncalculated compassion. Alistair watched for a moment, unseen, a strange, unfamiliar ache spreading through his chest. This wasn't an act for an audience. This was genuine, unadorned kindness, a selfless gesture from someone who had so little to give. He retreated silently, the image of Sophia and the stray cat inexplicably imprinting itself on his mind. It was another anomaly, another piece of data that didn't fit his cynical theories about human nature, especially human nature under duress. His carefully constructed worldview, the one that had served him so well in business and protected him from emotional entanglement, was beginning to show the faintest of cracks. The image of Sophia Rossi sharing her meager meal with a stray cat lingered in Alistair Finch's mind far longer than he would have liked. It was an inconvenient piece of data, an outlier in his carefully constructed theory of human self-interest. His associates, Marcus Thorne and Lawrence, were growing impatient, their inquiries about the game becoming more frequent, more laced with a goading amusement at his apparent lack of progress. "Still haven't found the cleaner's price, Finch?" Lawrence had smirked during their last poker game. Perhaps her tastes run higher than loose change. Stung by their mockery, and by an internal, unacknowledged frustration that Sophia wasn't conforming to his cynical expectations, Alistair decided to escalate his tests. The subtlety was wearing thin. It was time for a more direct approach to temptation. He orchestrated a new scenario, a plain, unaddressed envelope containing a substantial amount of cash, several $1,000s, enough to make a significant dent in Sophia's presumed debts. Was accidentally dropped in a deserted corridor he knew she cleaned meticulously at the end of her shift. He had the security feed discreetly monitored. He watched as Sophia discovered the envelope, her initial surprise, then a flicker of something unreadable in her expression as she looked around the empty hallway. She picked it up, hesitated for a long moment, her fingers tracing its thickness. Alistair felt a cynical sort of anticipation. This was it. This much cash, untraceable, a lifeline. But then, instead of pocketing it, Sophia carefully placed the envelope into her cleaning cart, and the next morning it was handed over, sealed and intact, to the head of building security, with a simple note in her neat handwriting. Found in corridor 7B, last night. Alistair, when informed, felt a jolt that was not triumph, but something far more complex, an almost unwilling admiration, mixed with a profound irritating bafflement. His next gambit was even more insidious. He arranged for Sophia, while cleaning a rarely used executive conference room late one night, to overhear a staged, hushed phone conversation between two actors he'd hired, posing as disgruntled junior executives. The conversation was carefully scripted to reveal a piece of seemingly valuable and ethically dubious insider information about a rival company information that, if leaked or sold, could net a significant sum, or perhaps curry favor with less scrupulous elements in the financial world. He wanted to see if the lure of a different kind of gain, one requiring not theft, but a betrayal of implied confidentiality, would tempt her. Again, he observed from a distance. Sophia clearly overheard the conversation. He saw her pause in her work, her posture stiffening. But after the executives left, she simply resumed her cleaning, her expression troubled but resolute. She made no calls, wrote no notes, simply finished her work and left. She didn't even report the suspicious conversation, perhaps fearing involvement or not knowing whom to trust. But critically, she didn't exploit it. Alistair's disquiet grew. Each act of Sophia's unwavering integrity was a small hammer blow against the foundations of his cynical worldview. His game was failing spectacularly, not because his methods were flawed, but because his subject was incorruptible. He found himself thinking about her constantly, not with predatory intent, but with a growing, almost obsessive need to understand her. What kind of person, facing such evident hardship, consistently chose the harder, more honorable path? He started to feel a strange, unfamiliar respect for this quiet, unassuming cleaner, a respect that was deeply unsettling because it forced him to confront the shabbiness of his own beliefs and actions. The truth that was revealing itself to him was not about Sophia's hidden price, but about the profound, unshakable existence of human dignity, even in the most trying of circumstances. He was witnessing a strength far greater than his own financial power, a wealth of character that made his billion seem almost vulgar. His associates, however, saw only his failure to break her. "She's playing you, Finch," Marcus scoffed one evening, "playing the innocent. You need to be more direct. Make her an offer she can't refuse, something that forces her hand. Put her in a room, lay out the cash, spell out what you want in return, something demeaning enough to be a true test. Then we'll see how long her precious dignity lasts." The crudeness of the suggestion, which weeks ago might have elicited a detached smirk from Alistair, now made him feel a distinct sense of revulsion. Yet the pressure from the bet, the taunts of his friends, and a lingering, stubborn refusal to admit his entire worldview was wrong, pushed him towards a final, more direct confrontation. He was beginning to realize, with a dawning horror, that the game was no longer about testing Sophia. It was about testing himself, and he was afraid of what he might find. He was learning that Sophia Rossi was not a subject in an experiment, but a mirror reflecting his own spiritual poverty, and the reflection was becoming unbearable. The pressure from his associates, coupled with his own perverse, frustrated desire to see his cynical theories validated just once by Sophia Rossi, pushed Alistair Finch to orchestrate the final act of his twisted game. He instructed his assistant to summon Sophia to his private office suite at the end of her cleaning shift, under the pretext of discussing a potential permanent staffing opportunity with enhanced benefits. He knew such an offer would be almost impossible for someone in her circumstances to dismiss lightly. Sophia entered his office, her usual quiet apprehension amplified by the unusual summons. The opulent space, with its panoramic views of the city lights beginning to prick the darkening sky, always made her feel small and out of place. Alistair was seated behind his massive, uncluttered desk, an enigmatic expression on his face. He gestured towards one of the plush leather chairs opposite him. "Miss Rossi, please sit. Thank you for coming." His tone was businesslike, almost bland, which unnerved her more than outright hostility would have. "I've been reviewing staffing needs," Alistair began, steepling his fingers, "and I have a particular project, a rather sensitive one, that requires absolute discretion and a certain willingness to perform tasks that might fall outside a standard job description." He paused, his gaze sharp and assessing. "It would be for a very limited duration, perhaps a week or two, and the compensation, I assure you, would be substantial, enough to resolve many, if not all, of your current financial burdens." Sophia listened, her heart beginning to pound. This sounded too good to be true, and a cold tendril of unease snaked around her. "What kind of tasks, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alistair leaned back, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching his lips. This was the moment. He outlined the task. It wasn't overtly illegal, nor on the surface sexually demeaning, but it was designed to be profoundly humiliating for someone with her quiet dignity. He wanted her to attend a private, upcoming gathering of some of his more boorish international clients, men known for their crude behavior and entitled attitudes, not as staff, but as a guest. Her role would be to be charming, agreeable, to laugh at their crass jokes, to fetch their drinks as if she were one of them, yet subtly subservient, to endure their casual, dismissive pats or overly familiar comments without complaint, essentially to be a decorative, compliant plaything for their amusement for an entire evening. He framed it as a test of her adaptability and social acumen for a potential higher-paying role as a personal assistant to a visiting executive. And for this one evening of utter self-abasement, he named a sum of money that made Sophia gasp internally. It was more than she earned in 2 years, enough to pay for her mother's critical surgery, clear their debts, and secure Marco's education entirely. He watched her, his eyes narrowed, waiting for the inevitable capitulation. He saw the flicker of raw, desperate hope in her eyes as the sum registered, the way her hands clenched in her lap. He saw the internal battle rage across her expressive face, the desperate need versus the deeply ingrained sense of self-worth. For a long, agonizing moment, she was silent, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond his shoulder. He could almost taste his victory, the reaffirmation of his cynical worldview. Everyone had a price. Then Sophia Rossi looked directly at him. The hope in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking sadness, and beneath it, a quiet, unshakable resolve. There were no tears, not yet, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was imbued with a dignity that seemed to fill the vast office, dwarfing his wealth, his power, his twisted game. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice low but incredibly steady, "the money you offer, it would change my family's life. And for that, for even the remote possibility, a part of me is grateful you considered me." She took a small, shaky breath. "But my dignity, my self-respect, they are not for sale, not for any price. I cannot do what you ask. I will not." She stood up, her small frame suddenly imbued with an immense strength. "If that means I must continue to struggle, then so be it. But I will struggle with my head held high." She looked at him one last time, a deep sorrow in her eyes, not just for herself, but almost, it seemed, for him. "I am a cleaner, Mr. Finch. I clean dirt. I do not wish to become it. And with those quiet, devastating words, she turned and walked out of his office, leaving Alistair Finch utterly alone, the life-changing sum of money still figuratively on the table between them. Her dignified refusal, so absolute, so unexpected in the face of such overwhelming temptation, and her known desperation, didn't just sting his pride or cost him a bet. It was like a seismic shock, cracking the very foundations of his cynical, carefully constructed world. He stared at the empty doorway, the echo of her words. I do not wish to become it, reverberating in the sudden, profound silence. His game was over. He had found her price. It was absolute, and in that moment, Alistair Finch felt his entire world, everything he thought he knew about people, about power, about himself, begin to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Alistair Finch remained frozen in his chair long after Sophia Rossi had departed, her quiet final words echoing in the opulent silence of his office. I do not wish to become it. It, the dirt, the moral compromise he had so casually tried to engineer. The world, as he knew it, did not just crack, it imploded. His deeply entrenched cynicism, his belief in the universal corruptibility of human nature, his conviction that money was the ultimate arbiter of all things, these were not merely challenged, they were annihilated by the quiet, unwavering dignity of a woman who possessed nothing by his standards, yet everything by a measure he was only now beginning to comprehend. Shame, a raw, unfamiliar emotion, burned through him, hotter and more cleansing than any anger he had ever felt. He saw, with horrifying clarity, the ugliness of his game, the hollowness of his victories, the profound spiritual bankruptcy of his existence. Sophia Rossi, the impoverished cleaner, was richer than he could ever hope to be. The following day, Alistair summoned Marcus Thorne and Lawrence to his office. They arrived expecting to gloat, or perhaps to discuss the next phase of their amusement. Instead, they were met by a changed man. Alistair's usual detached irony was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet fury that was far more unnerving. He informed them that the bet was off, that their game was a disgusting charade, and that he found their shared values, and by extension, his own past participation, utterly contemptible. He didn't just end the bet, he ended his association with them, making it clear that their particular brand of cynical amusement was no longer welcome in his life. They left, bewildered and resentful, but Alistair felt nothing but a grim sense of relief, the first small step on a long, uncertain road. Sophia Rossi did not return to work. Her neatly typed formal resignation was delivered by courier, citing only personal reasons. Alistair knew, with a certainty that twisted his gut, that he was the personal reason. The image of her face, pale with disappointment and sorrow but resolute in her refusal, became his constant companion, a haunting far more profound than any fleeting memory. It wasn't just her dignity that stayed with him, but the quiet strength it represented, a strength he now yearned to understand, to emulate. He began a period of intense self-reflection. He canceled his usual round of meaningless social engagements, retreated from the superficiality of his circle, and for the first time in years, truly looked at the life he had built. It felt like an elaborate, empty stage set. His first act of tangible atonement was to address the root of Sophia's vulnerability. Through a discreet philanthropic trust he controlled, he arranged for a substantial, truly anonymous grant to be awarded to her family, citing a fictional community recognition for long-term residents facing hardship. It was enough to cover her mother's medical care indefinitely and secure her brother's education. He ensured there was no possible way for it to be traced back to him. This was not about buying forgiveness, but about rectifying, in some small way, the pressure he had put her under. He then began to overhaul some of his company's employment practices, instituting better support systems for lower-wage workers, championing ethical conduct with a fervor that surprised his board. He was a man dismantling his old world, brick by painful brick. Months passed. Alistair threw himself into these changes, but the thought of Sophia, of needing to apologize to her directly, of needing her to know that her quiet refusal had irrevocably altered him, never left. He didn't use private investigators to track her down. He felt that would be another violation. Instead, he began a quiet, respectful search, starting with the cleaning agency, then piecing together small clues about where someone like her, someone valuing peace and dignity, might go to start over. He learned she had a distant cousin in a small, quiet town in Vermont known for its artisan communities and natural beauty. It was there, in a tiny independent bookstore that smelled of old paper and brewing tea, that he finally found her. She was working behind the counter, a soft, contented expression on her face as she recommended a book to an elderly customer. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment her eyes widened in startled recognition, a flicker of the old apprehension returning before being quickly masked by a polite neutrality. Alistair approached cautiously, his heart pounding. He was no longer the imperious CEO, but a man humbled, stripped of his arrogance. "Sophia," he said, his voice low. "Miss Rossi, may I have a word with you, please?" She hesitated, then nodded, leading him to a quiet corner amongst the towering shelves. He didn't try to make excuses. He simply laid his soul bare. "I came to apologize," he began, his voice thick with a sincerity she couldn't doubt. "For everything. For the game, for the offer, for my blindness, my cruelty. There is no excuse for what I did, for how I treated you, for the position I put you in." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, not necessarily forgiveness. "Your refusal that day, it didn't just end a bet, Sophia. It shattered my world. It made me see myself, my life, for what it was: empty, cynical, devoid of any real value." He took a shaky breath. "You taught me what dignity truly means. You showed me a strength I didn't believe existed, and in doing so, you saved me from myself." He paused. "I don't expect anything from you. I just needed you to know, and to ask if there's any way, any small thing I can do to support your dreams, your happiness now, without any conditions. It would be my honor. You deserve every good thing." Sophia listened to Alistair, her expression unreadable at first. The bookstore around them seemed to hold its breath. She saw the raw sincerity in his eyes, the absence of any artifice, any lingering trace of the cruel puppeteer he had once been. She had heard whispers, through distant connections, of changes at Finch International, of a new philanthropic foundation, but had dismissed them as corporate PR. Now, faced with this humbled, transformed man, she understood. The impact of her refusal had indeed been profound. "Alistair," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, "what you did was deeply wounding. It made me question many things." She paused, her gaze searching his. "But what you say now, the journey you seem to have taken, it speaks louder than any apology made in haste." She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. Perhaps there is room for a new conversation, not as employer and employee, but as two people." It was not an immediate absolution, nor a swift return to any kind of romantic entanglement. It was the beginning of a slow, cautious rebuilding. Alistair didn't push. He respected her space, her pace. They started with occasional, hesitant phone calls, then quiet coffees when he would visit Vermont, not as a billionaire descending from on high, but as a man seeking genuine dialogue. He learned about her life, her dreams of opening a small community literacy center, her quiet passion for fostering a love of reading in others. He listened, truly listened, and offered support for her ambitions in ways that were respectful and empowering, never transactional. Sophia, in turn, saw the consistent effort Alistair made, the genuine kindness that now seemed to guide him, the way he spoke of his past with a quiet shame but also a newfound clarity. She learned that people could indeed change, that wealth did not have to equate to moral decay. He had played a twisted game to find her price, believing every soul was for sale, every ounce of dignity negotiable. But Sophia Rossi's dignified refusal, in the face of her own desperation, had shattered not just his bet, but his entire cynical world. For Alistair Finch learned that true wealth isn't measured in billions, but in the unshakable integrity of a spirit that refuses to be broken. A spirit that can, in its quiet power, illuminate the darkness in another and even help rebuild a man from the ruins of his own making. And Sophia learned that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most profound lessons in forgiveness and the resilient strength of the human heart. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Alistair stood beside Sophia, both of them wearing work aprons, sorting donated books at the newly opened Rossi Literacy Nook in her Vermont town, a project he had quietly helped fund through entirely transparent, community-focused channels at her specific, humble request. There were no grand gestures, no lingering shadows of their tumultuous past. Just two people working side by side, sharing a quiet smile as a child excitedly picked out a book. His world had indeed been shattered, but in its place, something far more valuable, far more real, had begun to grow.